I really wanted primary colleagues to be confident in taking an approach that's right for pupils who were right at the start of their learning.
And we were team teaching together, and I could put my hand up and say, Miss, you wrote this. So when we think about the non-present reader, we get a chance to actually ask you why you wrote it the way that you did.
The podcast might be able to pass on some of the knowledge that experienced teachers have developed so that our younger colleagues need not make the same mistakes. But do you think there's an argument for making those mistakes?
And what it looked like was diary entries. Diary entries are the most important thing that children need to know about when they leave school. And actually, is that really what we think? Okay, well, if it's not, what do we need to be making sure we're exposing children to that will secure the foundations they need for secondary school?
Welcome to Thinking Deeply about Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Tricia Moss and Sallie Stanton, authors of How to Lead It, Primary English. So Sallie and Tricia, it's fantastic to have you here. How are you guys?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Very well, thanks.
Awesome. So we're going to explore primary English and the essentials for anyone who is attempting to lead it across a school or a group of schools. But I thought we'd begin with a little bit about who you are and how you got here today.
So I'm Sallie Stanton and I'm the Chief Education Officer for Advantage Schools. So we're run all through Trust. We have 10 schools across Bedfordshire, including nurseries up to sixth form. And my role, kind of broadly speaking, is to oversee the quality of education across the Trust. But I'm coming up to really scarily my 20th year in the profession, which is really scary because I already had another job and career before I came into teaching. And when I came into teaching, I trained actually as a secondary English teacher. But for the last 10 years, I've been working kind of at Trust leadership level across the primary and the secondary phase.
I'm Trust Curriculum Lead at the Diocese of Ely Multi-Academy Trust, DMAT. We're a very large, at the moment, primary-only trust in the east of England. We've got 38 primary schools. And I lead across all aspects of curriculum, but I'm also the Trust English specialist as well, which I think is probably the part of my job that I absolutely love the most. But all curriculum content is just really, really exciting for me. So I've been doing this job for about 7 years now, and I work with an amazing team of English hub leads and English subject leaders as well. So while we've been working together over this time, we have built and written our own English curriculum, which has been really impactful for us. And a big reason why we did that was because before I started this role, I was really reflecting on what it was like working in school and the different competing priorities that we had and the things that I'd learned. So really taking that all together and then thinking about what we could do with this power of having so many English subject leaders able to focus on the same thing. And very similar to Sallie, I've been teaching for 20 years now, which is also really scary for me because it was my second career as well.
Fantastic. And it's lovely to have you both here. Because when I think about multi-academy trust doing things in the way that I imagine they should be done, Advantage and DMAT are two of the trusts that come to mind when I'm thinking about, really great things in education. So much so, Tricia, that you managed to convince me to be a trustee for DMAT. And so I spend my time traveling up to Cambridge every now and again. But, I think I'm a massive fan of the work you guys are doing. So, when I saw John was releasing a series as a series editor, you guys were the first people that I thought I really need to speak to about primary English, not only because it's really, really, important, but I think our audience are all very, very keen to do a really good job when it comes to this, So I think if we start, thinking about leadership, which elements of English leadership were you most trying to help leaders think about or act on more clearly?
I think if I start with reflecting on when I started this journey, I reflected on what I did when I first became an English lead. So I became an English subject leader very, very early on in my career. As I said, I changed careers, and previously I'd been an editor. So it was an automatic, oh, Tricia was an editor, she knows all about English, she'll be a great English lead. And so the first thing I did was I picked up the action plan, and I looked at what had been done in previous years, and I just started doing that to begin with. So I was organising book fairs, I was organising author visits, organising World Book Day, organising phonics training, reviewing the English policy, looking at teacher planning, doing book scrutiny, moderating, analysing lots of summative data. So I thought I was doing a really good job. I was very, very busy. Lots of data collection, lots of doing, but actually there wasn't any return on learning. As I started to learn more and more about the restraints of working memory, I started to think, well, actually, if our working memory is so limited, if background knowledge, particularly vocabulary, is so important, what are our steps to get us there? And so that really started to change my approach to how I was leading English in my setting. I became much more strategic in my thinking. But it took me a few years to get to that point. So I suppose when Sallie and I first started thinking about the content for this book, we wanted to make sure that we could shortcut and really think for, help leaders identify what are common pitfalls, and then to really support them to consider, well, what is the evidence base for what is really effective and impactful, to really think about, how we can think about that return on learning for all learners, and really thinking about that in concrete terms as well. Really, well, yes, we've got the theory, but what does this actually look like in practice?
I'd say I was coming at it from a very similar place to Tricia, obviously. I guess there was a slightly different angle, that my background as a secondary English teacher and subject leader meant I'd spent years thinking about kind of the secondary English curriculum. And for quite a lot of that time, I was working in an upper school. So we didn't get pupils until year 9. And I tended to teach a lot of the sort of borderline grade groups at GCSE. So your old CD borderline, grade 4 borderline pupils. And those pupils tended to have loads of gaps in their sort of competence within the subject. And there was that real sort of pressure to, we've got to get them through, partly for the school, but, mainly for the kids, actually, that having that qualification will make a huge difference to their future and their options. But I think about it, and I really feel for those pupils, because those, I can almost guarantee, are the kids that have been taught to the test their whole life. They've had someone pushing them through their SATs. They've had someone probably, it was before the phonics screening check, but all of those things would have been kind of, we've just got to get you over the line. And I wanted more for that group of pupils, but it was so difficult to work out, like, what do we do about these gaps? Because by that point, English has become such a broad domain, and the elements that students need to be successful are so interrelated. So if we think about something like handwriting, and I know you've done podcasts before where even the whole podcast hasn't enabled you to get into the detail of what's needed to address children's handwriting, but these children are 14 now. Or reading, when they were sort of still struggling with decoding, for example. And as secondary English teachers, certainly at the point I trained, I didn't feel that had given me the knowledge or the skills that I needed to help pupils with that kind of foundational knowledge and those gaps. And all I ever wanted was for them to experience success. So I kind of used to take a very systematic approach to trying to move pupils forward step by step. And sometimes I would kind of be challenged a little bit that my way of doing that wasn't very Englishy. It didn't feel kind of like an English lesson, almost kind of like that idea of, if we expose children to kind of the workings that sit behind creativity, we destroy creativity kind of thinking. And then I think this was around the time that I probably started engaging with things like Research Ed, and I remember hearing, or I might have read something that Daisy Christodoulou had talked about, really focusing on the components of practice and that they might not look like the end result. And it struck me that you don't really question that if you're talking about music. Like, you teach children scales and it doesn't sound like a concerto, but that's a building block. And PE, that we do drills and we coach around drilling particular skills, and then we put them together into the composite. And even subjects like maths, where we focus on kind of real foundational factual knowledge. So for me, then I moved into a secondary school, and part of my role there was thinking very deeply about the catch up for the year 7 pupils, and then working across phase, starting to work with primary colleagues, and just absolutely loving thinking about getting the foundations right, the sequencing, and really focusing on what matters. And at that point, I started to learn heaps from all these primary colleagues, and I was really fortunate to be in that position. But I could see, again, lots of practice in primary felt as if it was pressured by a bit of a sense of emulating what secondary Englishy stuff looks like, but quite surface level. And I really wanted primary colleagues to be confident in taking an approach that's right for pupils who are right at the start of their learning, but also to have in mind still that sense of what English as a subject is really about and what disciplines it ultimately relates to. So I think there are some kind of things that teachers were doing, but they might not have known why. Some of them might not have known why. So really trying to think about, when we're talking to children about the idea that there's a writer that has created this text, that's how we introduce children eventually to the idea that they can analyse and interpret texts. And one of the things that a lot of primary colleagues do around predictions, we're going to predict what happens next, and that's can be seen as a way to engage pupils with the text. But actually what we're really doing there is we're starting to induct children to thinking about narrative technique and structure, and how writers work in a very sophisticated way to share some information, withhold other information. And of course, when we start talking to children about their opinions about texts and their ideas, again, it's not just to engage them in the text, it's because ultimately literary study involves constructing knowledge by dealing with the counterclaims of others, and that's how we frame knowledge. So I wanted to really think about how primary English leads can plot a route through all of that complex stuff and help pupils be really successful, but also for pupils to feel like this is a subject that's for me, and it's a subject that I love. And I feel quite passionately that isn't a joyless endeavour. So when we're talking about the real foundations, like learning to read or write, it's such a gift. It's possibly, I think I'd probably be as bold to say, it is the biggest gift we can give our pupils when they come to our schools. And we forget that because we're really competent in it. But when you see children learning to read, it's magical. And particularly where we've taken some of the ideas that we explore in the book, and we've really thought about how we might sequence our writing curriculum, suddenly children that have a perception of themselves as not good at English or not great at writing, they experience that success, and it's just so wonderful. Or when we've had children who are pre-verbal writing a sentence for the first time, and it's a child that is unable at the moment to express themselves verbally, but they can express themselves through writing. The professional joy that teachers working with those children get from that is what I would like us to be able to have in all schools. And I think Tricia and I were really wanting to create something that would help people think about these things and think about how they could enact some of the evidence around quality English curriculum and teaching in their schools.
We spend so much time in our schools walking alongside teachers and being part of the learning. And I was in a class last week where the teacher introduced a mentor text, a text that she had written, and we were team teaching together, and I could put my hand up and say, Miss, you wrote this. So when we think about the non-present reader, we get a chance to actually ask you why you wrote it the way that you did. And it's just these lovely learning moments that you can have with the children, and they get these light bulbs of, oh my goodness, we've got a real author here. We can be authors because of the granularity of the curriculum. We know exactly what we're doing. And Sallie a bit later would talk about the importance of zooming in and out, so that we do get that sense of awe and wonder. And that's really what we wanted English subject leaders to really have, that knowledge base to be able to bring into their settings as well.
The most valuable education books are those that are born of experience and expertise combined. So I think already I'm thinking this is definitely a must read. And I remember Daisy. It was Daisy said about footballers don't practice matches all week, and a penny just dropped for me. And it must be somewhere between 2014 and 2017. I was like, oh yeah, well of course that makes so much sense. Why are we doing it the way we're doing it? But if I could jump back just a little bit, Tricia, you mentioned about your move to strategic thinking. To what extent do you think that sort of shift is a rite of passage, or do you think that a book has the capacity to almost save people time? Because there's an element of thinking that certainly whenever I'm doing this, the podcast might be able to pass on some of the knowledge that experienced teachers have developed, so that our younger colleagues need not make the same mistakes. But do you think there's an argument for making those mistakes so you understand your practice a bit better? I don't know, and it's not a loaded question, I promise.
It's a really hard answer to that, because I think with everything, hopefully we're all reflective practitioners, and we always look at the evidence base. We think about, well, how's it going to work in my context? Where we have the opportunity, we visit schools, we go to conferences like Research Ed, and how do you pronounce it?
Tadape, is this how? Yeah, that means it's random.
Hopefully we do all of those things, but I think for experienced teachers and strategic leaders, we can have the curse of the expert, and we can think, this is the journey I went through. Everybody else, if they go through a similar journey, they'll have this same level of depth of understanding. But then if we think about novice learners, you need to have really, really strong mental models to be able to draw from, to be able to make those links and connections. So I think this book helps shortcut a lot of things, but it doesn't take away the really hard thinking. And I think that's probably where I'd come to on it. We can jump over a lot of things that we might do that aren't going to be effective, and say try and avoid those things, but then we still need to do the really hard thinking to make sure that this is the curriculum and it's being delivered with pedagogical principles that align with what we do in our school.
I mean, yeah, that sounds fantastic to me. I think, yeah, that's absolutely it. There is no substitute for deep thinking, is there? So yeah, 100%. I mean, Sallie, you mentioned sequence a couple of times. Would listeners be right to assume that in terms of writing, that is almost like a sentence level, real granular progression through the act of becoming a writer? Is that a fair assumption to make?
That's certainly sort of in our trust. That's something that we've moved towards really explicitly, is really thinking about like a mastery approach, basically, where if we ask children to write too much or to write things that they have not been taught how to do effectively, but that's a bit unfair, especially if we're judging them then on that, because what we're doing then is we're not really assessing our teaching, are we? We're just thinking about what pupils are arriving able to do. So we've really tried to break down into very granular steps, kind of what's the grammatical knowledge that pupils need, and to build that into a writing curriculum. So very much working on sentence level writing and building up to more extended writing. Of course, we also have to support that through thinking very carefully about the structures, the larger structures for writing, and explicitly teaching those as well. So yeah, basically though, that sequence I think is really important, and is certainly something that we've seen the impact of, that then pupils are able to experience success when they're writing, and feel much more positive about the writing process as a result of that. And the end goal is, of course, for pupils to be able to write beautiful and craft beautiful writing. But we know that there are steps that we're going to really work on with them and support them through along the way.
The obsession with genre really flabbergasted me with the whole way through my actual time in the classroom. I didn't really see why we were doing instructions in year 1 and year 3 and year 5, but that's a rant for another day.
I just think as well, though, I do remember when I kind of was first looking at sort of some curriculum maps and working with other primary leads, and sometimes where perhaps for varied reasons, workload being a huge one, sort of that big oversight of the curriculum, as Tricia said, that kind of zooming out and looking at the big picture, and you'd kind of set it out in front of the sort of English leads or curriculum leads and say, what's this curriculum telling you is really, really important? Like, what does it seem to be saying? It's crucial children leave this school knowing a lot about. And what it looked like was diary entries. Diary entries are the most important things that children need to know about when they leave school. And actually, is that really what we think? Okay, well, if it's not, what do we need to be making sure we're exposing children to that will secure the foundations they need for secondary school?
We're in we're almost like the precipice of a bit of a golden age in terms of the way we're structuring our thinking about writing and how to teach writing. The quality of conversation I don't think it's ever been better. But the risk is always that it's only the 5% who are engaging on this thing in their spare time that it sort of proliferates out to. But hopefully that's the function of the writing framework and the subsequent work that I know is going to come from that.
If you've ever wished for a maths curriculum that truly made sense from one lesson to the next, one that connected ideas, built teacher confidence and gave students a deep understanding of number, the story of mathematics might be exactly what you've been looking for. It's designed by classroom teachers, drawing on years of research into representation, reasoning, mathematical understanding, and it places professional development at the heart of the curriculum. Now, it's already being used in schools in the UK and around the world to transform mathematics teaching. You can take a short tour or learn more at alta-education.com/TSOM-overview.
When we say leading primary English, what does that involve in practice beyond, as you mentioned, Tricia, maintaining schemes, monitoring data, and preparing for external scrutiny?
In the book, what we've taken as a bit of a framework for this thinking is some work that Jennifer Barker and Tom Rees did, where they were looking at the persistent problems of leadership. So they're talking about school leadership. And when they talk about persistent problems, those are the sort of issues that will arise in all educational contexts, in all schools. So, whether you're working in a leafy school or a very disadvantaged urban school, you are likely to need to deal with these things. And they're things that we can influence as school leaders. So we took that framework, but we then thought about what does that mean to the role of English leader? So there are 7 areas that Jennifer Barker and Tom Rees set out, and I'll just talk about then how we related that to the job of English leader. So the first one is developing a professional and supportive culture. So in terms of English, we felt that was articulating the vision for the subject, but then also bringing your teaching colleagues along with you. So really consulting with them, collaborating and working together to solve problems that arise in the English classroom. The second one then is related to that because it's development of others. But we thought about that in terms of creating a professional development curriculum that will enable your teaching colleagues to deliver the English curriculum really well. Coaching your colleagues then specifically around the English curriculum and appropriate teaching methods, and also how they might use the resources in the classroom. The third one is the curriculum itself. So what progress looks like in English, what content you might prioritise, how you sequence things, the pedagogy that will support that curriculum. And then the fourth one is around behaviour. So we looked at that in terms of the learning behaviours that are important in English and how you'll establish these. So, for example, in English as a subject, discussion and debate is really important. But that doesn't mean that we're going to do group work because we're saying we're doing group work. It's really thinking about what does discussion of a text look like in an English classroom and how are we explicitly going to develop that in our pupils? And then the fifth one is around school improvement. So we looked at quality assurance, tracking progress, and responding with support. And we really wanted to think about like good quality assurance and not just quality assurance to tick a box. So quality assurance that really informs your school improvement and is very mindful of teacher workload as well. The sixth one that they outline is admin, which relates much more to the things that you kind of outlined. And again, sort of thinking about that admin stuff does need to be done. But again, we wanted to consider workload with that too. And then the seventh one was about developing yourself as a leader. So we've really tried to encourage people picking up the book to think about the further development of their expertise. You know, as Tricia said, you can't shortcut the hard thinking. So the book is, I guess, like a gateway into a world where you can engage with lots of further reading and further thinking about English as a subject. And then being able to kind of ground the decisions that you're making in that knowledge that you've got. And I think hopefully sort of being inspired to join a subject community that is, you know, there's quite a thriving English subject community, or you can develop those links across schools. So that really suggested for us the content and the guidance that we would focus on. So much of the book was then about developing that subject knowledge, thinking about specific areas of the curriculum, such as reading, writing, oracy, but also looking at things like quality assurance, progression and things like that. And I think the other thing with reading English is it is a real balancing act, at primary particularly. We've already talked about how important being successful in reading and writing is. Like, it's hugely important, and it's central to the entire curriculum and actually the entirety of a pupil's experience of school. You know, we know in secondary schools, a lot of behaviour issues have their roots in poor literacy. We know in society, a lot of poverty, poor life outcomes, mental health issues actually have their roots in poor literacy. So that job is very, very important, and we can't compromise on that. But so we have to zoom in a lot to those real component and foundational parts of the curriculum that pupils need. But then we need to step back from that, as I said, kind of looking at that curriculum map and saying, what's this telling you is really important? You know, that it's a huge domain. So you kind of are constantly balancing being in the minutiae and looking at the detail with being able to zoom out and think about the bigger picture. And I think part of that as well is advocating for the subject. So knowing its importance, but also what English is. So, you know, you've got to be able to, you know, think about how valuable the English leader's work is. It is really valued in the in the primary school phase, because everybody knows how foundational it is, but also knowing yourself that you're creating children's really early experiences of literature, and that's also a really fantastic opportunity, but it's a big responsibility as well.
Because English is it's so many subjects, isn't it? It's reading, writing, oracy. It can be really tempting to say, okay, we're going to have a reading lead, a writing lead, an oracy lead, maybe even a phonics lead, and then it can become very fragmented and compartmentalized. And so you need to always have that oversight and be really clear about, well, what are we focusing on at which points in our curriculum? Where do we need to have more of a laser focus? And at this point, where are we going to have a different type of focus? And I think having that absolute clarity and that strategic vision, it then means that an English subject leader can then have those really meaningful conversations with their head teacher and leadership team to then say, right, this is what we're focusing on when you're doing your lesson visits, when you're popping in and out of classes. Please, can you make sure, and whatever that focus might be, so that then you've got that collective buy-in from all of the leaders in the school, and that really helps build that culture and that climate of, well, this is every single child in this lesson or in this phase or across our school is going to become competent in X or Y, because we've allowed time for this in our curriculum, and we're revisiting it because it's building on what's come before. And it's that real sense of clarity over why we're doing what we're doing, and then checking in, are we doing what we're saying we're doing as well?
And that's the key, isn't it? Are we doing this, are they just pieces of paper or pages on the website, or are they actually things that are lived and breathed? I mean, there are a few things that, if I don't take us off on too much of a tangent, I mean, Sallie, you mentioned quality assurance, and I think striking that balance between accountability and sort of the developmental element of sort of leadership can be quite tricky. Are there any sort of principles or things that you guys do on the ground that help ensure that quality assurance, like you say, I think stays purposeful rather than just a box ticking exercise?
I talk quite explicitly about this to members of kind of the team that I work with as well, is that whenever we're doing quality assurance, like just having the principle of being as curious as possible. Because if we don't do that, if we just walk in and go, X hasn't happened, X should have happened, do X, and we haven't undertaken that whole process of, oh, that was interesting, that teacher was teaching something completely different to what we thought was on the curriculum, or maybe they were approaching it in a way that didn't make sense to us from us walking in, the first thing we should be doing is trying to find out why, because there could be all sorts of reasons that had happened. And some of those, maybe that decision was the right decision. Maybe it wasn't the best thing that could have happened at that point in time, but it would have. No, I don't believe that any teacher walked into the classroom and say, do you know what, I'm just going to not bother doing things well today. That just doesn't happen. So somebody has had a good intention that might have taken them down a path that perhaps didn't work. So I would always go in with that curiosity of wanting to understand what's happening in the classroom, what's the rationale for this, what impact is it having? Because yes, we do have expertise, and I think we need to be confident in our expertise. And, Tricia and I have spent hours and hours and hours of our lives thinking very deeply about English teaching specifically. But we are walking into a classroom with a teacher who certainly knows the pupils in that room better than we do, and knows what's happened up to this point in a way that we just can't. So we have to ask questions. I think it's Vivian Robinson, isn't it, who promotes the open to learn conversations, where you're really trying to understand what's the teacher's theory of action, because if you don't engage with that, you're going to solve what you assume was the problem, which might not have been the problem, that they were actually actively guiding their own actions. So I think that curiosity is really important. And the problem with that is it's much more time consuming. Like, that takes way more time than having a tick list of, like, I've walked in the classroom, yes, your PowerPoint's compliant, you've used the correct font, you're teaching the correct book, and everybody looks like they're working really hard, tick, 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 walk out of the room. That was all great, because that's not telling me really anything about the quality of thinking that pupils are doing in that room and the progress that they are making.
I mean, yeah, it's almost like a philosophy of leadership that drives all your decision making after that. I mean, Tricia, like, many of the schools in DMAT are reasonably small. I mean, I think there's one school where it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in one class, or certainly there was the last time I visited. Do the behaviours of an English lead in that setting, as you described, because so many subjects, so multifaceted, is there anything you need to be considered of, or can you apply the same principles in just a slightly different context specific way? I mean, I don't know if I'm explaining that very well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think particularly if you're working across a phase. So when we developed our English curriculum, because over half our schools are mixed year group classes, we developed it so that we were thinking about phases. So we're thinking, okay, in Key Stage 1, this is a powerhouse of sentence structure. We're really thinking about simple sentences and compound sentences. We're really thinking really carefully about which coordinating conjunctions we introduce when. We're thinking about how we build our schema around story structures, and making sure that we've got that range of traditional tales, oral tales, myths, legends, and so on, so children have a really strong schema, so that when they go into lower Key Stage 2, we say, this is our powerhouse of really thinking about dialogue, and how we punctuate dialogue. It's our powerhouse for adverbial phrases. So we're starting to think about paragraphing. And then when we're starting to think about our story structures and the types of text that we're reading, we're building on all of that background knowledge from traditional story structures, so that if we're in year 3, we're saying, okay, so year 3, guys, we're reading Stig of the Dump here. It's the beginning of the story. It's a boring day. Barney's sister doesn't really want to play with him. He's at his grandparents' house. He's not really got much to do. He wanders off to the chalk pit. He's always told, don't go near the chalk pit, you might fall in. What's going to happen? And we've built that schema across Key Stage 1, so children know what inevitably is going to happen, and that's going to be the beginning of the adventure. So having that really, really clearly structured curriculum across phases means you know what the key moves are across that 2-year cycle. So you know what you're pulling out all the time. And when you're going into that granular detail, you know, well, my children in year 1, they really, really need to know where the subject is and what the predicate is, and that the predicate contains the verb. We know why they need to be doing that. And if you're then teaching in mixed year group classes and you're going across a phase, you've then got that extra, that extra element where you know that you then need to be thinking, okay, so this is what was happening in year 2. This is now what's happening across lower Key Stage 2. So for my year 2 children, this is the first time that they're experiencing this. So I've got to make sure that I'm really explicit with them about what this key thing is. Whereas for my children in lower Key Stage 2, we've already visited that and we're starting to build on it, and we're building on mental models and background knowledge from other texts that we've already read. So I think lots of the principles are very much the same. But if you are in those mixed year group classes, especially going across phases, you need to be really, really cognizant of the granularity of that curriculum and what they're being introduced to when. So you haven't got that curse of the expert and that assumed knowledge that they'll just get it through osmosis, because we need to be really specific with making that implicit knowledge really explicit. I don't know if that's explained it clearly enough.
No, I think it absolutely has. I mean, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, you know the way we say that what's good for pupils who have special education needs and disabilities is good for all pupils. Is it analogous to say what's good for small schools in this situation of leading English is actually good for all schools as well? Because what you're describing there sounds like really good practice, no matter what size your classes are, whether there's 50 kids in the class or 5. You know, would that be a fair assumption to make? I'm just trying to piece together what you sort of provided.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's always knowing, well, what's my endpoint? Where do I want the children to get to? And then thinking about the starting point for individual groups of children, and then thinking, okay, so what steps am I going to be making sure that I put in this lesson or this sequence of lessons to ensure that my different groups of children, so that's certainly not ability groups, that's not what I'm saying, but year groups, are they getting to the end point that I want them to get to, so they're ready for that next step in their learning?
What you described makes me just think of how when you're working with big challenges, like, you just have to think so deeply and so carefully about your practice. So what Tricia's described with a mixed kind of year group classroom, but also what you described when you're working with children with really complex learning needs, you have to think so much more deeply, and you have to question every step that you're taking. And of course, that's then really beneficial, because it's deepening, like, if thinking hard about what we're doing is how we get better. So whilst it is really challenging, I do think it's often those challenges, when we have to work through them, are often the key to unlocking greater expertise and greater practice.
It's a real shout out for, the power of maths and the power of networks. And if you are in that situation, having a buddy in another school that's a similar sort of context, and when you're at that planning stage, having those conversations with them, I think we can't underestimate the power of that.
Like, most of the emails I get about episodes are from teachers in small schools and thinking about, well, how can certain things help me? But I know of listeners who have made their own groups, whether it be on WhatsApp or email chains, because they don't have the fortune of being in a functioning group. Like for instance, the hub model you guys have at DMAT, Tricia, where they come together regularly to discuss their practice. So actually, being proactive and making your own sort of group with like-minded individuals, I think can be really powerful. So I totally get what you guys are saying. I suppose the only thing to add before we move on to the next question, there was a paper in 2021, because the future impact has come up quite a few times. I think it's roughly, if I've read the paper properly, it's about £7,000 a year in future earnings, that the boundary between a C and a D in English, or I think they said literacy in the report, because they had mathematics literacy and then the sciences, and they were looking, and this is old money, it was CD, so it must have been a longitudinal study. So, and I think that can't be overstated, because the impact that the sort of the core subjects do have on your future life outcomes, and potentially expectancy in some cases. Though I don't want to speculate too much, can't be overstated.
Can I come in with something anecdotal? So one of the jobs I did before I trained to teach was working in addictions. So I worked in a methadone prescribing service. So working with a lot of people who had experience of sort of prison, coming out of criminal justice, or also were just trying to sort their lives out of years of addiction. And the first thing you do when you sit down with someone in that situation is a big assessment. And the first question I would always have to ask is, how are you with reading and writing? Because there's a lot of paperwork to go through. And it was so common that the answer would just be not great, and that would be a real barrier, which if you think about then all of the other times that somebody in their lives needs support and help, that often you get directed to a website or given a leaflet or asked, even a self-help book. All of those things just aren't accessible to you, and you're so disempowered when you're in that position. And that was one of the real motivations eventually that made me go into teaching, because it felt like I need to try and get in front of some of these problems, because I felt as if I was trying to support clients in a way that actually, resolving their drug or alcohol problem just opened up a whole load of other problems and barriers that they then had to work their way through. And some of them would be in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even trying to deal with actually the legacy of what could have been got right the first time around. So it is one of the reasons I just feel really passionately about the importance of the role.
No, absolutely. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Chris Such begins the art and science with the description about the criminal justice system as well. I don't know if I remember this, but it's been a while since I read it. But it's massive, isn't it?
If you've ever finished an episode of Thinking Deeply about primary education and wanted to go further, to read more, think more, and connect ideas, Hey, What You Reading For is exactly where you should start. Each week, we curate the best thinking from across education, books that challenge assumptions, research that informs practice, and podcasts that broaden perspectives. From curriculum and pedagogy to sound leadership and international insights, it's your weekly companion for meaningful professional growth. And because we know teachers are time poor but enthusiasm rich, it's concise, evidence informed, and genuinely useful. Subscribe for free at thinkingdeeply.info.
What decisions do English leaders routinely have to make that are, I suppose, rarely discussed in the official guidance or training, but which you think matter most for your pupils' experiences of English?
So I don't know if these are necessarily decisions that all English subject leaders routinely take. I'd say that thinking about it, because obviously there are so many decisions, I would like to think that there's like my top three of decisions that I'm hoping that English subject leaders would be routinely making. And so we've talked about the time constraints, how many different subjects are within the subject of English, how we need to be zooming in and out, balancing breadth over depth, and so on. So I think my top three is building teacher subject knowledge, so that when we are looking at that curriculum, we are understanding how it's been constructed, why it's been constructed in that way. The importance of beginning the curriculum in early years, that because it's so easy to think, oh, well, we're not really writing until Key Stage 1. So we're not really going to think about early years, but actually there's so much foundational knowledge that we need to be building in there. And then also thinking about being the custodian of the reading canon. Something we talk about in the book a lot is the difference between a canon and a spine, and how having a reading canon enables you to curate these really, really key experiences and building key concepts for children over time. So if I sort of like track it back to building teacher subject knowledge, we need to think about the pedagogical content knowledge as well as the subject knowledge. How are we going to go about teaching this particular thing? So when I alluded to, there being so many different elements to English, and it can be tempted to having a reading lead and a writing lead, what can happen there is that if we don't build enough subject knowledge, and we have these routine conversations and these routine elements of professional learning, is that we can fall into the trap of, we can pop into a lesson and we can see a teacher saying, okay, so today, guys, we're going to be looking at adverbial phrases. This is what an adverbial phrase is. This is how we punctuate it. Let's have a go at writing some adverbial phrases. When actually, if you're coming with your reading hat on, you can be thinking, okay, we're going to read this text. I'm going to ask some questions about, well, when did this happen? Where did this happen? And then focus the children in and say, okay, so how do we know where this happened? How do we know when this happened? So what the author has done here is they've used something called adverbial phrases, and that helps us situate the text. It helps us know where or when something's happening. So it becomes much more joined up. And then when the children are using that in their writing, there's a real reason and a real purpose for it. So then they're not just using it in an individual piece of writing and having that one piece of writing really, really polished. We're actually improving the writer rather than the writing. So routinely thinking about, how am I constantly building teacher subject knowledge, and really thinking about all the interleaved elements of the English curriculum. And then thinking about early years, and as I said, that's so much foundational knowledge is happening in early years. So if we've got a problem with handwriting and we've got children in year 6 who still don't have a correct pencil grip, who still have writing fatigue, well, we can probably track all of that back to what their early writing experiences were. And, well, was there enough time in their early years, foundation stage, to be really building up those gross motor skills ahead of the fine motor skills? Were they pushing and pulling the trucks? Do teachers in Key Stage 1 understand that if they've got a pupil coming up who isn't comfortable holding a pencil yet, that they need to make sure that they are building in time in the curriculum, and particularly in PE lessons, to build those gross and fine motor skills with the children? So not just as an English subject leader, making sure that we know what's happening in foundation stage and having those conversations with foundation stage teachers, but routinely making sure that colleagues across Key Stage 1 and any colleagues all the way up through to year 6 who are finding that they've got children who have got particular barriers, well, where have those barriers come from? What is it that we can put in place to support them? So routinely making sure that early years is part of that conversation in English. And then finally, the element of the reading canon. There's such a breadth of literature out there, and in so many classes we have children coming in and they've just discovered a new author and this is their favorite author, and they're saying, can we have lots and lots of these books in the classroom? Can we read this book as a class? And so much enthusiasm and joy there, and it can be really tempting to just always be guided by the children. But then what happens is that we're not introducing them to authors and text types that they wouldn't come across unless we had introduced them to them. So routinely making sure that you establish why the canon has been built the way that it has, how it builds, how if we take a book out of the canon, what's that opportunity cost? What is going to be missing if we substitute it with something else? So routinely having oversight of the canon and routinely having those conversations with colleagues about the content of the canon, because what we don't want is to say, well, we created this canon 10 years ago and we're still reading these same books, because that then makes it really rigid and it's not a living, breathing thing. So we do want to be updating that canon, but as we're updating it, we don't want to be updating it and then missing something that's really key. If there's a particular theme that we're building with children over time, I'm thinking about in our canon, for example, we look at fables. We have very specific Aesop's fables that we read in foundation stage, and then we revisit some more Aesop's fables in year 2. And then in year 4, we read The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, which is each chapter, our main protagonist, he starts to learn a little bit more about himself, and he changes his attitudes and his relationships with other people. And what we do at the end of that novel study is the children, they rewrite that story as a simple fable. So by having the canon and being the custodian of the canon, if people are saying, well, we studied Aesop's fables in reception, we're studying them again in year 2, why do we have to read another one in year 4? We are then explaining, but we're building that schema. But if there's another fable that's going to do that job equally well, then let's have that conversation about it. So it's routinely having those conversations and communicating the rationale, the why for what we're doing. I think for me, those would be 3 things that I would be hoping that English leads would routinely be doing.
Like, listening to it just really highlights to me like how important the development of subject knowledge is. And I do think one of the decisions an English leader will need to make is, are we going to develop our own curriculum? Are we going to buy in a curriculum? What training do we access to support the curriculum? And I think that, because kind of your question was around what's sometimes not covered, and actually the subject knowledge that teachers need to deliver that curriculum is often missing. and in some ways, for completely understandable reasons, some kind of schemes and training resources kind of try to sidestep the subject knowledge issue. I don't think I'm misquoting. I think it's Andy Tarby who says that the text needs to be the beating heart of the lesson. And I think in some kind of, it relates to what I said earlier, where maybe lessons are trying to emulate what a secondary English lesson looks like. And it's kind of taken some of those sort of surface level features and turned that into perhaps a generic approach to teaching. This is how we teach a novel. And actually what needs to happen is the text needs to drive the focus. The text needs to be central to what teachers are focusing on, what questions they're asking. And it just doesn't work if you kind of feel like I have to ask a particular type of question today. So we've kind of working sort of with our schools, we've really tried to explore that and think very carefully about how do we build the teacher subject knowledge, for example, of all the different texts we're teaching. But I think Tricia used the term powerhouses earlier, to tap in to those kind of powerhouses as well. And how actually once you do that the kind of the idea that we must teach a lesson on predictions today sort of falls away, because you realize that can't work. And there's one example that we've discussed before where it's actually an extract from A Christmas Carol, where it describes in huge detail, I think it goes on for pages, the shops, and it personifies all the fruit and vegetables. I seem to remember winking onions and things like that. Like the fruit and vegetables are literally enticing people to eat them. And if you read that with a class and felt like, right, today's our predictions lesson, so we're going to read this extract and then we're going to try and predict what happens next. Well, it's not going to work, is it? Because what's really important there is, why is Dickens personifying the fruit and vegetables? And what he's really trying to communicate is that we live in a plentiful society where there's loads to go around. So the idea that people should be starving is ridiculous. But you're not going to be able to do that if you're thinking about, I need to predict with children today. But when we started to dig into that with sort of English leads, they said, but our teachers aren't always confident. Their subject knowledge isn't always strong enough to know how the text should guide them. And what can happen as a result of that is sometimes we ask children questions that we couldn't answer ourselves as teachers. And we sort of tell ourselves, but it's okay because it's English. It's all about the pupil's response anyway. But I think that what happens then is pupils are floundering. They're trying to guess what's in what they think you want them to say. And they come away with the idea that English is something they're perhaps not very good at. I don't know if you've seen that meme, like, why are the curtains blue? Which is like an imaginary conversation between contrasting like an English teacher asking the class, why are the curtains blue in this extract? Versus the author who's like, the teacher's coming up with, wants to elicit all these answers about it reflects the depression of the character and all this kind of thing. And the author's just like, the curtains are just blue because they just happen to be blue. Now, I think that's incorrect. Like, if you bothered to say the curtains are blue, there probably is a reason for it. But I think that meme's really popular with younger people because that's what English can feel like. It can just feel like you're having to create stuff for the sake of pleasing your English teacher. And I think that we sometimes are creating that impression by asking them these difficult questions that the text isn't central to. I feel like I've been a bit maybe critical there, but like the thing is, I've got huge sympathy for teachers in this position. So I do think, Tricia's given a beautiful example there of how, as leaders, if we're curating the books that pupils read, but we're also really communicating each text's place in the curriculum. That lovely example about Edward Tulane and how it links to fables, and actually how this is something that literature explores very often, is that journey of self-discovery as well. Then suddenly you've shared that with teachers and you're developing their knowledge about, oh, I get it now. This is why we teach this text. And, that's certainly what we've tried to do. We've tried to think about, okay, so once we've established why this text is here, let's start to think about what questions we might ask when we're teaching this text and what the most useful bits of the text to zone in on are. And I do think, listening to Tricia talk as well, it makes me think it's really hard to do that on your own. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be part as a trust to do that, but even just working with the teachers that know these books well, that collaboration is really important, because it's really tough somebody needs to be there to look at the big picture and bring the links together. But also it's really useful to be able to discuss that with other people and get their input as well.
I think what you said there, Sallie, about, having that conversation with somebody else is just so powerful, because things that you see and you just comment on something. So we read Journey to the River Sea in Upper Key Stage 2, and I was rereading it last summer, and I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, Eva Ibbotson loves doing things in twos. We've got twins, but then when she uses her adjectives, she has two adjectives at a time. And then I started noticing lots and lots and lots of things that she was doing. And I mentioned this to an English leader that I was working with. And then immediately, oh, yes, and did you notice this? And did you notice that? And then as we were thinking about planning, and we were saying, OK, so for this element of the book, we really, really want to think about foreshadowing, because we want to move on to passive voice and show, don't tell. And then suddenly all these things which, a colleague had identified and pulled out, and things that I had just read and not really noticed, we were able to have those conversations in a way that then was then going to really support them when they were teaching the children to read that bit of the text. So how did that make you feel? Did you think this was going to happen? And then having that opportunity for that leapfrog read. Well, let's go back and reread this paragraph. Let's read this line. Let's read that line. What's going on here? Piecing it together a little bit like a detective. And then having that opportunity to then have that whole class discussion. So it's very much a guided discussion. So we got to the point of getting a sense of this was going to happen. And now when we've tracked back, we can see that she gave us this clue here and this clue there. And this is how she did it. I'm going to do that in my writing. And it's that deep thinking and that opportunity to have those conversations, so that then you can do exactly the same thing with the children. And when you're in those sorts of English lessons, it's just absolutely joyful, because then the things that the children start spotting and noticing is really quite extraordinary.
Wow. I mean, the exchange you guys have just had there, that's a lifetime's worth of professional development, that you go into there. I'm thinking, like, you were casually talking about the role of the predicate in your curriculum. I mean, that's not a conversation most teachers have. And like, I think in terms of subject knowledge, I think maths is just as complex, but because it's hierarchical, you cannot go through the curriculum without understanding what came before. Whereas the cursive knowledge and perhaps the idea of threshold concepts, once we learn to read, we then never really understand how that process, it's just, this is something we've always done. And I think to an extent, writing is the same, and for better or worse, when we're writing as teachers, we're often just applying what we innately understand, but knew at some point. So I think the actual subject knowledge work is more difficult in English, because you've really got to break through that barrier to get to the point, well, what am I doing that I don't already, that I don't consciously know that I'm doing, if that makes sense. Whereas I think as in mathematics, if you're trying to find the area of a circle, well, you need you know which pieces of knowledge you need, whereas that might not be the case if you're looking at sentence structure. Is that a fair generalization?
I think so. But I also think in English there is an active sort of pushback often as well against that knowledge. If you think about phonics, phonics is curriculum content, but it's treated as if it's a method, and then people disagree with the method. And with grammar, I certainly was of the generation that grammar was not explicitly taught at school. And you read often writers of around my age saying, well, no one ever told me what a fronted adverb. Fronted adverb, it's always fronted adverbials, isn't it? But no one ever taught me what that was. And yet I'm a published writer now. I think I was one of those pupils who not innately, because I learned it, but I learned it through exposure. I read loads when I was growing up. Had a very lonely childhood. So I spent my time reading, and I think I absorbed a lot of the conventions just because I read so widely and so regularly. And I just think, well, lucky me, but not everybody, A, reads as much as I do, but also B, like can see that, like can from reading absorb it. And they do need, in fact, most people do need explicit teaching. But I think that in English, it's sort of almost, hopefully we're coming, the writing framework and how we can see the success that phonics is having in our schools means that we're coming out of that phase. But I think that English is a bit overshadowed by this sense of you shouldn't teach anything really. Like it's all just within pupils. They already know it. You've just got to kind of facilitate bringing it out of them, and they will be able to do it. And the value actually of explicitly teaching them is sometimes underestimated within the subject, I would say.
I'd agree with you wholeheartedly on that. And I think when you were talking about phonics, phonics, it harms none, and it's absolutely necessary for some, because you're actually you're revealing those structures. You're unlocking that code. You're making it really explicit for the children, and I think that's something that's really key for us. We need to really guard against the curse of the expert, things that we know now which seem so obvious, but they're only obvious because we've got so much experience and we've built that knowledge base. When you know, but until you've got no idea. And so let's use what we know from cognitive science, that actually novice learners learn best by explicit instruction, by being told this is what's happening. Now let's go and see if we can see it happening somewhere else in the text, or this is how we're building this structure. Now let's practice building that structure in our own writing so we can feel really, really successful in this learning.
In terms of doing things in isolation, or trying to avoid doing things in isolation, do you guys publish your canon, your curricula, your sequencing online? Because I've heard some people have said to me, they use Stanley Road, or they use STEP, or and some even use, Hirsch's Common Core. Although it's because it's built for an American audience, I think in all of these situations you need to look at your context and you can't just take someone else's idea. But as a starting point, is there anywhere that sort of listeners can go to see the kind of thinking you guys have done in your parts of England?
So we have a writing curriculum that is based on the Stanley Road curriculum, which then came from STEP Academy Trust, didn't it? And it also has been developed further by ARC with their sentence writing curriculum, and all of those three people, like that's publicly available. So we've used that for our sentence writing curriculum, and I'm just actually in the process of trying to. What I realised was missing for our teachers was a really obvious place where you could go to where it kind of flags up where all the links are in the curriculum. So we had kind of the writing was codified, the reading canon was set out, but I'm trying to kind of build a master document that will be much more accessible. That's not very helpful for your question because it's not finished yet. But what I would say as well is that in the book also we do have, in terms of reading, we've kind of given an exemplar of a reading canon and some sort of elaboration on why those texts would be useful and what the links might be between them. So those are probably starting points that people could go to if they wanted to look for examples.
It's very similar for us. So our writing curriculum started from key learning indicators that STEP Academy Trust developed long time ago now, and similar to Sallie with our reading canon is something that we use across our schools. So lots of our schools have the canon and various curriculum materials on their websites as well. So then listeners can see how different schools have approached it. So we have like a general trust approach to English, and then we have school specific examples as well.
So I mean, the last question is probably the one I've been looking forward to asking the most, because I think it really, deep thinking leaders, take a lot of time to consider these actions. But how should an English leader decide what to hold firm on and what to be flexible about when different pressures pull in different directions?
To start thinking about this, we've mentioned it already, but for me, it's about really, you can't be flexible on your underlying principles. Your surface level features are the things that you can be flexible on. So really knowing yourself, why you do what you do, why your curriculum is sequenced as it is, why these particular teaching approaches are promoted, that's really, really important. So if you don't know the why, everything is up for grabs, isn't it? So, and I think pressure's pulling in different direction. The main thing I see that causes problems is the pressure for performance, like feeling like you've got to demonstrate pupil learning, which we can't know pupil learning. We can only make inferences about it. And if teachers feel under pressure, I think it can lead to some really outcome-driven teaching, really over-scaffolded adaptations for pupils with special educational needs, or activities that will enable pupils to get something down on paper, but that might not be really developing their mental models and getting them to think really hard. Learning to read and write, I think it's pretty clear from what we've said so far, but that's non-negotiable. Like that's not up for question. Like that has to be really important. You have to think about the most effective way to do that, and you have to have the components really carefully sequenced, making sure pupils are successful before they move on. So taking that mastery approach, like absolutely don't be flexible on wanting all children to learn how to read and write. So be really dogged about those children that go into year 2 that haven't yet passed the phonics screen, but like beyond year 2, right the way through, making sure children can read with automaticity, and that they're able to decode so that they could move beyond that aspect of reading. To do that, you've got to know about the science of reading. Like, we talked earlier about that idea that phonics doesn't work for everyone. When people say that, what they really mean is for some reason this child isn't mastering this knowledge. So we need to understand what the barriers are for that child and support teachers to overcome them, not just go, oh, well, let's try a different way of teaching reading to this child. And similarly, the writing framework, I mean, actually what the writing framework does for me is sets out that we do actually have quite a lot of research about what works when it comes to writing instruction that perhaps people just weren't aware of before. So that gives a really useful starting point for us as a profession to think about. We need to know much more about how children's grasp of writing develops and how to support them with that. So getting those foundation right is really, I don't think that's something you should be flexible on. And we've talked a lot about the curse of the expert. So we must remember, so kind of when we're thinking about underlying principles, remember cognitive load theory. So remembering that working memory is very limited and that younger children haven't chunked as much yet. So that means that what we think of as one item might be 4 to them. So really like leaning into that and thinking, right, how can we break it down? Have we broken it down enough? Encourage children to have plenty of practice so that they automatize all that they can. Like, we don't want them having to worry about handwriting in year 6, for example. So really making sure that we are dogged about ensuring that children aren't left behind at those very basic steps, those kind of foundational steps. And then I think you can think about what to flex around. So the question kind of that you're asking then is, well, what's really core to the learning? If you're going to do, if a teacher wants to approach a lesson in a slightly different way, are they thinking about what children should be thinking about in that lesson and what children will be practicing? Because if that links to the core learning, then maybe the end product that comes out of that lesson might be different. Maybe the children might be writing a different text or producing something slightly different. And maybe that's okay because you're confident they were thinking about the core aspects of learning you wanted them to think about. And, you know, Tricia talked about changing text. Like if somebody wants to teach a different text, well, why? Is it just because they fancy it, because they've seen something on Instagram about it? Or is it because actually they've really thought about what the text currently in the curriculum's purpose is, and they think they found another example that will really benefit pupils and will do an even better job? And something Tricia and I kind of have talked about quite a lot is waggles, model text. So what a good one looks like when we're providing children waggle texts, and sort of thinking about, is it better to kind of say, here's a waggle that we're all going to use, and then we've got real control over that. We know that that's only going to feature the grammatical constructions, the vocabulary, the spellings that we've taught children, and that we're not going to be overloading them. But actually, one of the downsides of that is that you as a teacher aren't having to think really hard about actually how difficult it is. So when you start trying to write those waggles, having done it, I can tell you it's so hard. And this is kind of what then I also go back to when people talk about creativity, like where's the challenge in the curriculum if we're doing it this way? But actually, if you set real sort of strict parameters around a sentence, it's really difficult to stick. So it's very challenging in itself. And I think for teachers kind of needing to think really hard about that, that's also a really useful part of the planning process. But maybe you do need to be flexible because you need to balance that desire to get teachers thinking hard and really engaging in their preparation for lessons with the reality of workload in schools and the amount of things that teachers have to do. So I think that's when conversations are really important, trying to find an optimal kind of pathway through those difficulties. I'm not sure if I have answered your question, and maybe I ended up going off at a tangent there, but I think just going back to those kind of like, what do we really value? What are our core principles? Align around those. And then the other stuff you can consider whether flexing on that undermines those principles or not.
Some really good examples are if somebody's coming in and they're offering a writing workshop, an author visit with a writing workshop, and you think, well, this will be great for the children. They can meet a real author, they can find out what inspires them and so on. But then that writing workshop can sometimes then not align with what we know are our best bets for teaching children how to write. So then it's having those conversations and explaining to visitors, well, we'd really like this bit, but that bit isn't how we do things here, and that's going to confuse our children, so please don't do that bit. or if we've got people coming in offering to be reading helpers and listening to children read. And we know that you only get better at reading if you practice reading. But if the person coming in to listen to the children read hasn't been taught how you teach reading in your school, then that, can actually undermine a lot of the work that you're doing. So it's the rationale for why you're doing what you're doing needs to really underpin what you're flexing on and what you're sticking close to.
Tangents from passionate teachers. I suppose that's the whole point of the podcast genre, because otherwise we could just do it in a blog, couldn't we? But so never apologize for that, because I think what you guys have outlined, I mean, the whole way through this sort of conversation is that your principles drive your decision making, and we know a lot about the effective teaching and learning in English, and some of those apply more generally across all learning. But you can see how, as leaders, we can be guided to be the most effective versions of ourselves, but we have to engage with both our context and the act of thinking about our practice. So I think it's been absolutely fascinating. I mean, just looking on the website, how to lead a primary English is actually, there's some sort of website price saving. It's only $10.25. So I think schools and trusts should be buying these by the bucket load, while as possible. I think it's $17.09 normally, but for some reason it says, there's 40% off. So Bloomsbury didn't email me. I went to you guys. So this is a genuine, get the book if you possibly can, especially if it's pertinent to you guys, because there's only so much we can cover in this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to getting even further into leading primary English, even though it's not something I'm ever likely to do. But listening to you guys talk about it, that's the kind of thing I like to nerd out on this, is the intricacies of practice and education. So all the stuff to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you, Sallie.
Thank you ever so much. It's been really lovely. I always love talking to Tricia anyway, but it's been really lovely to have this conversation today.
Thank you, Tricia.
Thanks so much, Kieran. It's been an absolute pleasure. And just the same, Sallie. We can't talk enough about English, can we? We love it when we get together to do it.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening. Just a slight interjection here. Obviously, I didn't realise at the time that the discount was for February, and this episode was going out with less than a day of February left. But actually, we spoke to Bloomsbury, and they've said that anyone listening to this episode and wants to use the code HTLI English, so that's ENGLISH 30 HTLI ENGLISH 30, then you can get 30% off for listening to the podcast. So get your school business manager, don't bite yourself, get your school to buy for you.